G'day everybody, I'm Richard Glover from the ABC. Welcome, thank you for coming. At other parts of this Festival of Dangerous Ideas, they're doing woozy topics like should the Pope be tried and Israel and Palestine, simple stuff like that. We're doing the tough one today, housework. I've been invited to be the chair today because I've just published a defiant book called Why Men Are Necessary. It came out yesterday, and so I'm the person who's got enough testosterone to withstand the battering we chaps are about to receive. I notice some brave men here taking notes about how they can redeem themselves. I also notice with alarm many women also taking notes. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rebecca Huntley. She's Director of Ipsos Mackay Research and has spent a lot of time talking to ordinary, everyday Australians in their houses about how they feel about all sorts of things about life, including this issue. She's author of a couple of books, a very famous one on Generation Y, but most recently Eating Between the Lines, and she has a PhD in gender studies and has thought quite deeply about the hand grenade she is about to throw. Can you please welcome Dr. Rebecca Huntley?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for getting up not only early, but an hour earlier than you might normally do on a Sunday that's raining. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have a lot of opportunity for questions, and you should feel free to ask me the most difficult questions that you can think of. I don't actually think that the idea I'm talking about today is particularly dangerous. I think it's fairly uncontroversial. I think what's dangerous is that I have offended both men and women in the title of this talk. So it might be dangerous for me afterwards rather than during the talk. I don't know if anybody attended the Festival of Dangerous Ideas last year, but the President of the Islamic Federation of Australia, Kayser Trad, argued at that festival that Australians should be open to the idea of legalising polygamy, a form of polygamous marriage in which a man has more than one wife at the same time. When I heard about Trad's idea on the radio, I thought it was an awful idea, because if Australian men could have more than one wife, this would simply lead to more disappointed Australian women. And Australian husbands would have an excuse to do even less work around the home than they do now. And I think that they'd be forced to do even longer hours at work than they do now to afford these multiple wives and their shoe fetishes and so forth. The issue of men, women and unpaid work is a topic that has intrigued me since I started researching my PhD thesis in the mid-90s. That thesis looked at, amongst other things, the changing status of women from the early 80s to the early 90s. What data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics clearly shows is that during this period, women's workforce participation increased quite significantly from around 40 to 53% between 1982 and 1992. However, the Bureau found that at that same period, married women with children who were employed full-time spent 19% of their day on unpaid work compared to 11% of men. So we had a significant increase in women's involvement in the paid workforce, but what was happening in the home barely changed. And even if both men and women were employed full-time and had kids, women were still doing 19% of the work around the home compared to 11% for men. Now, this was an extraordinary period in Australian history in terms of what was happening with women in the public sphere. So we saw the introduction of the Sex Discrimination Act. This was a formative time for women's policy development, for women's involvement in government. We had women becoming premiers and all those other kinds of things. So a lot was happening for women in the public sphere of work and politics and government. Yet we were still doing almost as much as we had done previously in the private sphere of the home. So I was thinking at this time, why is it that the gender division of unpaid labour is so difficult to change, and who or what is to blame? In 2008, I went back to look at the statistics about men and women and unpaid work for a book that I was written on food. And I really wanted to see, well, what has happened since the 90s and what's happening in the 2000s? And the news was still pretty discouraging. In 2006, the ABS released a report called How Australians Use Their Time. And that showed that for men, the average time per day spent on domestic activities had not changed since 1992. So it remained fixed at an hour and 37 minutes a day. And over at that same period, the average time women spent daily on domestic activities had only declined 10 minutes. So 3 hours and 2 minutes a day in 1992 to 2 hours and 52 minutes in 2006. And although we can't tell, I think that decline was mainly due to the fact that we're beginning to rely more on, let's say, take-out food or cleaners to come in and help us do our work. So women were doing a little less work, maybe they were lowering their standards, or maybe they were getting people outside to help them, but men were doing exactly the same thing in 2006 and they were doing in 1992. But, I hear you say, men work longer hours at paid work than women do. But actually, that can't account for the disparity. In their 2001 report on unpaid work, the ABS said, when comparing the time spent on household work by men and women employed full-time, women were more likely than men to participate in unpaid household work and spend more time actually doing this work. In addition, while there was a large difference between time spent on household work by women employed full-time and those employed part-time, there was little difference in the time spent on this work between men employed full-time and part-time. So in non-ABS language, what that means is if there's a man working full-time and a man working part-time, they pretty much do the same amount of work in the home. If a woman's working full-time and a woman's working part-time, if she is doing part-time, does much more work than either the woman working full-time or the man working full-time or the man working part-time. That means if your husband is at home and he's working part-time, he's pretty much doing exactly the same amount of work as he would do as if he got a full-time job. So that is not very encouraging, and I think 2010 we can have a female Prime Minister, but men still won't put away the laundry. And I think when men start putting away the laundry, we can really get excited. The deliberately provocative title of this talk was inspired by a recent study by economist Almudena Silva Sanz of Oxford University, who surveyed 13,500 men and women aged 20 to 45 from 12 countries. And she interviewed them and talked to them about their attitudes of gender, housework and childcare responsibilities. And in that survey, Australian men ranked the bottom of a list of 12. Now, we don't just trail behind the usual suspects like the Scandinavian countries, and frankly they annoy me, they're just good at everything, so I almost want to kind of exclude them. You know, well, where are things good for women? Scandinavia, other than Scandinavia, I don't care, they've obviously got it right, I don't know what it is. But we also rank behind the United States, Japan and Austria. And this is significant given that what Sevilla Sanz found in that study was that men and women living in gender egalitarian countries are more likely to cohabit and marry, have children and therefore boost the birth rate. So perhaps we should be giving a bonus to men to do housework rather than women to have babies. I'm serious, we should be giving a $5,000 housework bonus to men who do housework because it'd be just as good. That's important than actually having a baby. So are Australian men just lazy? And I just don't think so. I think when men are paid to work, we know they work pretty hard. Are they biologically incapable of housework? I don't think so if you consider the fact that men in other countries seem to be able to do it. Will men's behaviour change over time with generational change? I think to some extent yes, but I don't think we can pin all our hopes on this, and I'll explain that later. Is the solution merely to hire cleaners and get takeaway every night? And I just don't believe that. I think the latter isn't a healthy option and the former is only an option for some. And I always wonder who cleans for the cleaner. My theory is that the reason why men are so slow at changing is that women have let them get away with too little for too long. So up to this point, I've talked to you a lot about statistics, but now I want to share with you some qualitative research from the most recent Ipsos Mackay report that we have done on the mind and mood of newlyweds, first home buyers and new parents. So that report was entitled Starting Out, and it was based on a series of 16 group discussions with Australian men and women ranging from mid-20s to early 30s, so, Generation Y essentially, starting to have kids and get married. And the fieldwork was conducted in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Wollongong and Ballarat. It was fascinating listening to the men and women who we talked to in this research. The dissonance between the sexes in their approach to unpaid work in the home was pretty clear. On the male side, the men were excited about the prospect of a new home, wife and baby. So they really talked about it at length and in some very positive terms. One young dad in one of our groups said, having a kid does change your attitude to work. It's a wake-up call. You want to spend less time at work. Another father talked at length about rejecting the pressure to do the hours at work that was present when he was single. He said, you did the 13-hour days and you didn't think about it. Now I get in, work and get out so he could go home and be with his child. So for dads, this was all positive. They're really excited about playing an active role in their kids' lives and much more active than their own fathers. So it was a very upbeat feeling in those men's groups. The women were not less than upbeat. They were kind of exhausted. And in fact, they talked at length really about the frustration of their partner's shortcomings when it came to household chores. They were keen to discuss the constant negotiation around dividing up the domestic load, the flare-ups and the resentments that emerge when one partner is exhausted and the other inadequate. One woman captured the mood by saying, my husband says he'll help more, but he says, not does. Now, listening to these couples speak about their lives, and, we separated them, so we talked to women separately from men. It was never really obvious to me what these women were actually doing to encourage their partners to share the load. In some cases, it was clear that they were somewhat fearful of demanding too much, lest it lead to too much conflict, or worse, an outright rejection of their requests. And in some cases, there was evidence that women were actually shutting down their partner's offer for help. So consider this exchange between two women in one of the groups that we conducted. And the first woman said, I know a few people where the woman earns more than the men, so the man stays at home with the kids and the woman goes back to work. Woman number 2 says, yeah, Craig had a good idea about that one. I said, no. 1, he can't cook. 2, he really struggles with the washing machine. 3, now when we're using cloth nappies, I think Lily would be toilet trained or running around nude. And I thought, poor Craig, surely learning how to boil some pasta and turn a few dials on the washing machine isn't beyond him. He offered to stay home and look after his child, and she immediately just said, no, you can't do it, you're not capable of it. And it's actually not very difficult to learn how to do. And I kind of wonder why she didn't open up the opportunity to let him do it. The whole idea and the whole concept that the division of unpaid work in the home will shift over time because the current crop of young men are more accepting, have been raised by working mothers, is certainly one I think we can pin some hopes on, but not all. And I say that because we can, in the Ipsos Mackay report, read back 30 years, 3 decades, and see what people were saying in the late 70s about these very questions. And it's not very encouraging. So, for example, the first report we ever did was called Mothers and Daughters and was written in 1979. And it was clear there that the mothers of 1979 were convinced that their daughters, who are now in their 40s, would form better, more equitable marriages. As one of the mothers put it, my daughter is going to be different when she gets married. She won't put up with as much as I put up with. So there's always been that hope with each generation. My daughter's assertive, she's smart, she's good, she'll be great at her job. Therefore, when she becomes a mother and a wife, she'll demand a different deal. Excuse me. I think Richard told you I'm not well, but we'll get there. But on the other hand, the teenage daughters in that report in 1979, who are now in their 40s, were actually scathing about their father's contribution around the home and suspected that their brothers were going to be exactly the same. So there was a couple of comments in that report I want to share with you. The first was one from a girl in her late teens who said, men have thought of pathetic. My dad thinks he's great if he washes up. Another woman said, my brothers are just turning out like dad. They sit around and let mum and me do everything. So there was even though there was a hope from mothers of that time that things would change, there was a sneaking suspicion amongst the daughters that it wasn't going to change easily or quickly. And then we can go back to the ABS statistics today and show that in 2006, it was found that young men spend an average of 4 hours, 5 minutes a week on domestic activities compared to young women who spend on average 6 hours to 46 minutes a week. So although we can hope that generational change will happen, we can't pin all our hopes on that. I often hear women justify their greater domestic burden on the basis that we are just better at housework, more sensitive to dirt, and generally place greater emphasis on neatness and order. Better at cooking? I would say watch a couple of episodes of MasterChef and think again. Better at cleaning? I have a male cleaner who cleans my house much better than I do, and you don't need a vagina to dust a shelf. In fact, I would recommend it against it in the interest of hygiene. I'm more concerned about domestic order. I think that might be the case, but I believe we have been conditioned to be concerned about that, given the different social expectations and judgments made about messy women compared to messy men. And think about the original meaning of the word slut. It actually didn't relate to a sexually loose woman, it related to a dirty or untidy woman. I believe men can change because we find this evidence of this in our research all the time. We did a report, the first report we did this year was a report on retirees, which is such a silly name for them because I've got to say they're some of the most busy and vibrant people we encounter in our work. And in that research, we discovered a new species of male which we called the domestic grandad. And this is a guy who, perhaps as part of a desire for new adventure or to give back to family after years of being consumed with his work, is really happy to take on the role of primary homemaker and caregiver. In some instances, this is because his wife is still working or more active socially, and he feels it's appropriate to be more hands-on in the domestic front. And we met a number of men who kind of were happy to talk about this transformation from breadwinner to homemaker at the end of their life. And so these were guys who were brought up with fairly traditional values. So one comment from our research, this guy who said, "My wife's a teacher and was teaching full-time, so we talked about it and I said, right, I'll retire, you continue teaching, I'll look after the house, the shopping, the cooking, the cleaning and everything else." And she said, "That's fine." I was in Dubbo and I met a whole lot of former Vietnam vets, and one of them was a former Vietnam vet and now truck driver who spoke about the satisfaction derived from looking after yourself. And he said, "Now I'm retired, I don't see why my wife needs to be cooking and cleaning after me. I come home and I cook a meal for myself, I do the washing up, I throw the stuff in the washing machine. It's not that hard to do." So this all leads us to what can men and women do to ensure that we start to change the way we do things at home in order to ensure greater equality and, I would argue, greater domestic harmony. I would say that women have to get better at picking their partners, not just for their capacity to protect, provide and procreate, but for their skills at childminding, cooking and ironing. It's up there. It needs to be in the vows. Once we're in a relationship, we need to be willing to do two things. The first thing we have to do as women is we have to make room for men to do stuff. There's a wonderful moment in a not very good but recent rom-com called Date Night, which Tina Fey and Steve Carell play a married couple with kids whose relationship is faltering. At a critical point in the narrative, the wife is complaining about the stress of work and family life, how she has to do everything for everybody. And her husband responds in a way I believe perfectly encapsulates the predicament of men who want to be better husbands but feel blocked in their efforts by their spouses. So this is what he says. He says, "I know you work hard, but you know what would make the work 10 times easier? Me. If you would just trust me to handle things once in a while, but you don't. You have to do it all yourself, your way. You have me screwing up before I even have the chance to come through for you. And yes, maybe I might buy the wrong toy for the birthday party or make the jam sandwich the wrong way, but if you just let me do something for you, I might surprise you." So I really love that, which is just basically give me the opportunity, give me the chance to surprise you and give me the chance to help. I think the second thing that women must do is not run for the argument. I can't tell you how many times friends, colleagues, as well as the women in our research report say they decide to pick up the dirty underwear rather than have an argument about it. And it might seem like the easy way out, but I think it's the martyr's path, and I think it's a miserable one at that. I think we also have to feel not guilty and feel like we have the right to ask for what we want. And I see this as the equivalent of what happens in the workplace can still now, despite women's achievements in the public sphere. We know that women are notoriously bad about asking for the promotion, about asking for the raise. Do we think that the boss will just notice that we're really good at what we do and just give us these things without us asking? We should feel that we should ask for that in the workplace, but we should also feel like we need to be able to say to our partners, you need to do A, B and C, and not feel guilty about it. And finally, if all of this fails, I think there is some room for a kind of a Lysistrata inspired sex strike. So, as all of you know, there's quite a famous play by Aristophanes where the women of Greece try to stop the Peloponnesian War by withholding privileges, and I think that there's something to be said for shutting up shop until the saucepans are washed. That's a fallback position, I have to say, but we need to try the other less manipulative ways first. And what should men do? I believe they should just grow up and stop expecting their wives to be their mothers and start cleaning up after themselves. And as the man that I talked to as an ex-Vietnam vet and truck driver said, it's not that hard to do. And both men and women have to do their best, I think, to fight the relentless pressures of our labour market, whereas each year passes we seem to work more and more and have less and less time for domestic duties, sport, cooking, holidays, community activities, being with our friends and enjoying the beautiful, unhurried moments of life. Real social change, really lasting social change and important social change, I think, happens slowly. Yet the changes in the way we allocate responsibility for unpaid work are happening at a snail-like speed. We are still stuck in 1992, and I don't believe we can afford to be. I believe the quality of our relationships and of our family life is at stake. I need to end this talk with a note of thanks to my husband, who washed up and put our daughter to bed as I wrote this talk and is currently making pancakes at home with our 2.5-year-old. So I shout out to him. Thanks, Daniel. And that's it. Time for questions.